Hi guys, and welcome to another session with the ASP.NET Core Part 5, and in this section we'll talk about Web APIs. So we'll go over a couple of things, what Web APIs are and the uses for it. Then we'll talk about the MVC pattern, the framework that's going to be used for our Web API, and then the routing and how this routing comes into play, similar to the previous tutorial with the ASP.NET Core Part 4, or was it Part 3? I can't remember which one, where we talked about the Razor pages and how we did routing on that when a request came in. So we'll talk about that as well, because this is a little bit different than that. It's still routing, but it's done a little bit differently. And then we'll have to, of course, create a Web API. We'll use our blog post that we've been working with and the database stuff that we created. So we'll just use those models using Entity Framework. And then we'll talk about the once you have this Web API, how do you then consume it? And then figure that out. And then we'll look at some of the tools, some of the clients and stuff that you can use. Now, really quick to what Web APIs are. In the old days, when you had a computer, you had, let's say, an application, and that application consumed some DLLs. Those DLLs then had classes, and those classes had some methods that you would access, right? So that's basically what an API is, application program interface. So in the current context of things, those assemblies that you had created, and now let's say you want to expose it to people, but they don't understand, or their application is written, let's say, in Python or Node.js or PHP or Java or something, right? Another different language. How would they then consume this? You would need to have some kind of contract in between. Can these really happen? Some of the interfaces are in there for different programming languages, but others are not, and some are very clunky and difficult to work with. Some are not even being supported. So the best way to expose the things that you have is through some kind of a service. And that service has to have some kind of protocol that you can use. Well, HTTP protocol is the best way to do that. And so Web API is basically a framework sitting on a server, and you're accessing it through HTTP protocol. And instead of rendering HTML or image or a JavaScript or CSS, it will actually render an object. And this object can be represented as an XML or a JSON. Now we'll be working with our Web APIs, and we'll do JSON because it's a lot easier to work with, and it's pretty native with the Web APIs. Although XML, you can actually ask it for XML, and it'll return XML for you, but we'll stick with JSON. So the Web API is basically a framework sitting on a server, and it just renders JSON objects based on the solutions that you build. But this is not just about APIs that you build. You can actually expose other things, a service that you may provide and allow people to use that. For example, you could have some kind of a grammar checking application or spell check, or some kind of timekeeping application, a to-do list, task list, stuff like that, right? So then you could expose it so it can expand beyond what a program that you write. It could be services as well. All right, well, with that said, let's actually take a look at the Web APIs in action and how we can implement it within our application that we built so far using Razor Pages. So here we are with our blog website, and if you remember, we actually had connected using Entity Framework, using SQL Server, and if we go here to our SQL Server, actually our SQL Server is not up. Let's go ahead and enable and run that. Okay, so there it is. That's our container. Let's go ahead and run that. And while it's running, let's go ahead and see if we can get our server to respond. There we go. And if we go take a look at the tables, you'll notice that we have our blog posts, the categories, and the tags. So we'll just keep these as is. And if we come over here to our data, we have our blog context, and we have all our categories, and we have everything in place. So we'll basically be reusing these. Now, the next thing we want to do is, because this is our front-end website, and we want to create a web API. You could have the web API hosted here as well, so that you could consume it and then other people can also consume it. But the way I generally like to do it is to keep the application separate. And the reason I like to do that is because now we have two different websites, and the way this site will depend on the so the dependencies right now as you have is the blog context. So the blog context and all its models or dependent on this application. When you create a web API and you're accessing it through HTTP protocol, you'll only be dependent on the object that's coming back. You're not going to be dependent on anything as far as entity framework is concerned. So let's go ahead and actually create a new project. So now this interface should be familiar with you guys. And so what I'm going to do is use C#. This is going to be basically all platforms. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a web API. So now here's the web API. I'm going to choose next. And then what do you want to call it? So we're going to call this our blog API. Or we call it super duper blog API. And choose next. So in this wizard page, we have the options to set our default template. We're going to go ahead and use .NET 7. That's the latest currently supported version, so we're going to go ahead and use that. For authentication type, we're going to choose none, but you do have some options using Microsoft Identity or Windows. And the reason for this is because we want to make this as simple as possible. This is just the example of how to set up a web API, but later on some tutorials we'll create a section to where how to implement authentication to either your web page or to your web API. And this basically will restrict who can access your API. And you would want that if you're going to do something in production, but for now, just learning and everything, you want to keep it as none. Next, what do you want to have configure HTTPS? We're going to disable that for now. If you had enabled it, it's similar to the previous videos we did for Razor Pages, where this will install a certificate to your certificate store, and anyone connecting to your web API server, then what we'll do is that it will communicate using the certificate back and forth and keep the network secure. The packets going back and forth will be secured through HTTPS. We're not going to enable Docker, and we're going to use controllers instead of the minimal APIs. And this is basically allowing us to create a class that's going to inherit from the controllers, API controllers class. Then we can put all our actions inside of that versus actually coding this ourselves. So we'll look at the examples of both of them and how to do that. And so we're not going to use the minimal stuff. We're just going to use the controller. Next, we're going to use the enable open API support. Now, what this is going to do is going to allow you to have a page that's going to document all of the controllers that are available, basically those interfaces, and what parameters, those actions that you're going to be calling that's going to accept, as well as what kind of results coming back, or if you're expecting exceptions or anything like that, what they were going to look like. So that really helps out as far as like other developers trying to consume your API. So for now, we're going to enable this. We're not going to go in detail of the Swagger documentation of how this is done, but we will touch base on some of the aspects of it as we are developing. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We'll go ahead and create. So that created our project, and as you can see, they're basically the same icons, and that's because they're both web-based. And if you open this and you go to your program, you'll notice something very, very similar to what we had for our Razor Pages. We've gone already over how the Razor Pages are done, and it's very, very similar to what we did previously. If you look, they are both web application builders that is getting set up. The differences are what the services that we add. In here, we're saying add controller, and then we're mapping those controllers, and this is where the routing happens. So same thing, the services in here, and now we're adding Razor Pages, we're working with static files, and then we're mapping those and routing the Razor Pages. Well, we're doing the same exact thing over here. So that's basically what is set up in there. Next, the services that we're adding is basically Swagger generation and also Endpoint for API Explorer. So the Endpoint API Explorer used by Swagger, and this is the documentation we discussed that's going to be generated for you. And this Swagger doc was going to use the Endpoint API Explorer. You could actually do the Microsoft implementation of the documentation versus using Swagger, but Swagger gives you a little bit more of a clear of as far as like what the APIs look like, and this is something more standard in the web APIs people are using, so that's probably why this was added. But that's basically what and why we have these services added in there. Then of course we do the build so that we can build the services, and then now that we've got the services built up, we pass back an app, the web application, and then we check to see if it's development. If it's development, then we're saying go ahead and use the Swagger and Swagger UI. So now that we have implemented the Swagger and added the Swagger, it's going to go read all of the controllers, and then based on that, it's going to generate a UI so you can see those actions and any parameters that you may have. Next, the authorization. It says use authorization. For us, we decided not to use it, so we don't have anything in there, so it's not going to do anything. And then the last thing it's going to do is basically it's going to run the app for us. And now this is basically what we discussed before, where it's going to tell you what you want to start with. Do you want to start executing this program as inside of IIS Express or inside of IIS, or use the Kestrel internal web server that ASP.NET Core has for you. So that's pretty much the differences between the two programs and how they're being started up. Is just the services. The other thing is now if I run this, it's only going to start my blog website. It's not going to start the blog API. So what you can do is if you go to your solution, you go to properties, you can see here right now we have a single startup. You can have multiple, and then you can say start. And if you run it, both of these applications will run. So let's give it a minute for it to compile. And once the compilation is done, because this is the first time we're running the web API, it's going to compile everything. So now you have two web pages. One is our normal web blog page, right? You can see, as you can see here. And the second one is our API. And this one already has a sample controller in here with Swagger already integrated. And this is what I mean about a documentation. All right, so now let's take a look at how API Explorer works with Swagger. So here I have our application. We already mentioned that we have the services over here, and we said that Swagger will depend on the Endpoint API Explorer to generate this page for us. But how does it actually figure all this stuff out? Well, we mentioned that it's going to use the Endpoint API Explorer. So what I've done here is created a very simple application for us to test. It has exactly the same sample in here. And I created a new controller, and I am actually routing it to a API and then controller, and the name of it is documentation controller. And inside of this, all I have is this document controller, which uses injection to pass the API Explorer for us, and I put a breakpoint for this. So if we run this, so we can take a look at exactly how this works. And once the page is executed, of course, we get our weather forecast, and we don't want to use that. We want to go to our API and then / documentation, which is going to be the controller over here, right? And then enter. Now, of course, this is not working, and the reason it's not working is because we don't have a index page in here. So if we go in here, you'll notice that we actually have a method in here called get. Let's just actually copy and paste this, but we will actually make this null. So we're going to return null. And we're only doing this, and of course, This actually could be void. If that's the case, then we don't even need to do this. So we just want to create this method so that the endpoint is able to be hit. So let's actually run this now again so that we can actually get into the breakpoint in the constructor in here. Okay, so now we're going to go API, and then on this one we're going to have the name of our controller, because it's going to be documentation controller, and hit enter. So now we're able to get into the constructor, and this is being injected for us. So we have our API Explorer. So if we were to go look at the API Explorer, you'll notice that it has the API description groups. And if we open that, it has these action, or excuse me, items, which is a property. And if we open that, so actually it also has a version, which version is 0. If you open the items, you'll notice you have the API description, which is an array, which has some items. And now we have our controllers. So we have the documentation controller. This is the one that we actually are set up for the documentation, and then we have our weather forecast controller.get, right? So this has all of the information we need in order to generate documentation for it, right? So this is how Swashbuckler or Swagger uses the so this is how the Swagger generation and the Swagger and using the UI to generate this information for us. So what you're seeing here is based on that. So now let's talk about MVC and what it is. MVC is a pattern that Microsoft had been using with ASP.NET for a while, and now it's part of the Web API. And generally, the way the web works is, if you had seen any of my, I believe it was the HTTP protocol tutorial that I did, that talks about how the client and the server works, and in the middle, the communication happens using HTTP protocol. So when an HTTP request is made, that travels over through the HTTP protocol, and some server that is trying to reach is going to intercept that, and then it's going to figure out what to do with that request. In this case, because this is running inside of, let's say, IIS Express or even IIS, the framework would register itself, and then that's how the IIS web server would know how to route. So once the request comes in and it defines that this request is for the web API, then it would pass it through the pipeline, and the framework for ASP.NET Core would pick that up. The MVC pattern, the way it's been developed, is you have a controller, and that's basically a traffic cop. And what it does is, when it receives a request, you decide what to do inside of that. So the controller is going to have multiple actions, and those actions decide what to do. Maybe you have a get, you have a post, delete, and a bunch of different HTTP verbs in there. Next, what happens is that you need, from the controller, you need to access something. In this case, they're showing a data access layer. So if you're going to a database where you're using Entity Framework or ADO.NET, it's going to make that access and read that data into a model, an object, and that's what gets passed back as a response to the client. So in MVC and Web API, we don't really have a view, because right now we're just seeing the controller and a model, but there's no view. And when we watched the previous tutorial, we talked about the Razor pages. You can have a Razor page as a view, and later on we'll take a look at that and how that actually will work. So with that said, let's actually take a look at how the model view controller and the routing and stuff will work. So here we have our web API, the SuperDuper blog API. And the first thing we did when we mentioned earlier was that we added a controller, and then we did the mapping for the controller. And so if you go into the map controller, this is the source code, and I've set it up so that when I navigate through, I actually get the source code here. As you notice now, this is a extension method, and so it's using the this keyword. So if we go back, this app is really a web application, right? So because we get the builder, and the builder does a build, and it passes back a web application. So how did we end up with this I endpoint route builder as the part of the this extension? Well, if we go back to here and we go to the web application and look at the source code, you'll notice that it actually inherits from the interface iEndpoint Route Builder, and that is how the link there this is how this extension works. So it just takes this interface from the web application and calls it endpoint, and it goes through and creates a data source, which creates a default builder. And so once you get the default builder, then you can access the information. So how would you do that? So what you can do is over here, we'll just say app, but then if you try to see the data source, it's not there. And the reason it's not there is because we need to cast this as the iEndpoint endpoint route builder. And so once we have this, and then we can get the data sources. And this data source is a property, so it passes back a collection. So we need to have a variable here. And then we can actually look inside of this to see what's going on. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here and start this. I've also added a few more controllers, and we have, for example, the test controller. This is just a default one. When you right-click and you say Add and have a new controller, you can choose the Web API default, and this is what you get. That's so you can see a little bit more, and I have a debug one there, and we'll take a look at what that's for. So now that we have our breakpoint, and if you come over here, so we have our endpoint, and it has only one in the collection. And if we go inside of this, you'll notice that we have these endpoints. If you expand this, you'll notice now that we have the controller, debug controller, test controller, get, post, and put, delete, and then our whatever forecast controller. So if you now go through this and look at the documentation, so you notice that we have our debug, and we have our test, and we have our forecast. So now that we can access this, we can see how that routing happened. How would you then see this when you are inside of your controller? So if we go to our weather forecast, let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. And also let's go to our debug controller, and I'll explain what this is doing. I created just a default controller with nothing in it, and then in the constructor, what I did was I said that we have a endpoint data source, and then have that associated to a private read-only value here. And then I have just a get, and the reason I need to have this get is in order to be able to access this controller, there has to be some entry, and so you need either a get or a post of something in here in order to get that. So let's go ahead and run this again, and let's take a look. We don't need this anymore, so let's continue. Okay, so now let's go to our weather forecast and click try out and execute. So now that we are inside of this, let's go ahead to our locals. We have this. Now the HTTP context usually has request, response, and a bunch of different other properties that you can use, but those are also available here within as part of this. So this is the response that we're looking for. If you go to response and you scroll down, you'll notice that we have, or excuse me, we don't need the response, we need the request. So if we go to the request and we come down, we have this thing called route values, which has the keys. And if you open the keys, you have action and controller. And so this actually is, this is the property that we are accessing. So this is the internal values. And then we have the values, which is basically, we said there was action, so the action is get, and the controller is weather forecast. So this is how you can come in and get the route values if you were interested on that. And if you want to see some of the features, you can also come over here. So that's how you can get this routing information when you are inside of the controller. But what if you wanted to see something a little bit more than that? So let's go ahead and continue. And let's go to our API debug and do a tryout and execute. So now that we are inside of this, the controller was populated for us, and we can go now look at the endpoint data source, and this is pretty much the same thing as we saw before in the as part of this endpoint in here. So if you come over here and you expand this, and you go to the endpoints, and you notice now that we have our debug controller, our test controller with all its actions, and our weather forecast with its action. So you can see all of the route pattern, a bunch of other information on that. So this is how the routing is happening for our MVC. If we now go to our weather forecast controller, so we said that this is the controller, and you can also give it some information to decide how the routing happens. In here, for example, we have our route and we have controller. This is just specifying that, you know, if you pass the name of the controller, then it just be the name of the controller. And when we executed this, and if you look at this, it's a part of, if you were to just duplicate this and go in here and just expand this, let's do a tryout and let's do an execute, and you'll notice that it actually took our the name of our server, which we're actually using localhost, so it's going internally at the port, and it just had the weather forecast. Now, when you look at the test or debug, you notice it's actually going to API. And so if we were to go look at the debug controller, you'll notice now that we have told it that there's an additional API / the name of the controller. So that's how it knows for routing that it needs to have this API. So if we were to go here and let's say execute this, of course it's going to do a breakpoint, that's fine. And if we were to take this and try to access this without the debug, it's not going to find it. So that's how the routing can happen, and you can create these decorators to tell it how to route. So now let's go ahead and take a look at something else in the weather forecast controller. And if we scroll down, we'll see that we have our get operation for get weather forecast, but we also have a name for the HTTP get weather forecast. And what is this name and how do we use it? Is this part of routing or not? It's actually not part of routing. So let's go ahead and actually create a new method to kind of test this out, because the name is generally used for generating a link. So we'll go ahead and create a new method, and that method we're going to pass back a string. And the string is actually going to have the URL for the get weather forecast name that we're specified up above. So let's call ours get weather forecast link. And then inside of the body, we're going to go ahead and create a return value, and we'll create a link, a URL, and use the link and pass it a parameter, and that's going to be the name of that HTTP get that we used above for the getting the weather forecast. So let's go ahead and copy that. And now there's an additional value we need to pass, which is the values. There are no route values that we need to pass, so we're just going to go ahead and keep this as null. Now, this, of course, is going to give us an error saying, or a warning that it might be null. If you don't specify the name correctly, or the name is not found, it will return null. And so you're going to have issues. Now here we know that it's going to work, so let's go ahead and execute this. Before actually executing this, let's go ahead and go back, and we have to put an HTTP GET on this. The reason for this is that in order for this to show up as a method to be used, it needs to have an HTTP verb. But here we're going to notice that we now have two methods. They're both getting HTTP GET. If we run this, we're actually going to get an error. And let's find out what that error is going to be. You should realize that this is because they're both gets, there's a conflict. And that conflict is both of them mapping to the right to the actual get method. So you're even getting an error in loading the definitions. So if we were to actually now try to hit the weather forecast, you'll notice the exception you're getting is it's saying that we have a conflict because we have multiple endpoints mapping to the same URL. So now we can use the route method to make it unique so that even though we're using multiple gets, it doesn't conflict. So here we can just name it anything, but we're going to just name the same as the method, or the action, I should say. Just execute this, and now we shouldn't get an error. But now we should see our additional action here. So notice that here we do have our action. So if we were to go ahead and try this out and execute this, you'll notice now that the response body that's coming back is the URL for our action that we have for the weather forecast. Now if you try this out and execute, notice that this URL, request URL, is exactly the same as the body of our new method, which is basically the same endpoint. So that name is generally used for generating links, and so that's what it should be used for. It has nothing to do with routing. The next thing we're going to go over is that we mentioned that the web APIs can actually return either JSON or XML. So by default, it's been returning JSON. And we know this because if we go up here to our weather forecast and we click try and execute, notice that it's actually returning JSON object. And if you look, we're just accepting text plain but nothing else. And nothing in the web API here told it that we expect JSON or anything. So by default, it is expecting JSON. Now you could add the XML values in here and or have it to return XML, and to do that is we're going to say add XML data contract serializer formatter. And so once we set this formatter to the controller, the next thing we need to do is in the weather forecast, and now if you execute this, it'll still will return JSON. So what we need to do is put another decorator or attribute in here, and that's going to be produces. And the produces, what we want to do is basically pass the application and tell it that it's going to be XML. So hopefully the hot reload will work. Actually, it's not. So apply and rebuild. So I just rebuilt everything, didn't do a hot reload. So now that we have our method and execute this, and notice now we're getting everything in XML. So this is another way where you can have the data return XML. And here notice that we are actually accepting application.xml, and that's what we were basically passing. So let's talk about if you actually have to use controllers and the web API. And the answer is no, you don't have to. So if you go back to the programs, we can go ahead and comment everything here. And then, because we're going to disable all the Swagger stuff and adding the controllers as well as the mapping. So now if you run the application, and what will happen is that you'll get an error because the page that we're trying to hit, which is the Swagger page, won't be available. Now that happens because of the properties that are set within the project. So now that we have our, as you can see now, it's trying to hit Swagger. And how is this actually set up? Well, that's because if you go to the properties and the launch setting, you'll notice that we have a bunch of settings in here for either IIS Express, HTTP, or this is for IIS. And so we're using HTTP, so it's going to go over here. But notice that the launch URL is Swagger. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the application URL and add Swagger in front of it, and that's how it's going to map that the URL. So because there's nothing, we turned that off, that's why you're getting an error. So let's go ahead and stop this and go back to the programs, and now we're going to create an endpoint, and we're going to map an endpoint, and we're going to show some results. It's going to be, so as you can see, we still have our classes over here, so it's not really being used, or it's not doing anything, even if you try to map to this, because there's no routing. So in here, I'm just going to copy and paste some code that's going to do a mapping for us, and then I'll explain it to you. So the very first thing to note is that this is actually exactly the same code that we had for the weather forecast, the example that we had. And so in here, as you can see now, we have a variable that has the bunch of strings inside of it. And then if you can see, we say app map get. Now this map get is basically the same thing as the Razor Page tutorials that we did in ASP.NET. It's the same exact thing, except now we're saying that if anyone comes in through this endpoint, we're going to then run this piece of code in here. And this piece of code is basically using the summaries variable up here to enumerate and generate 5 arrays for us, and then we pass that back. So if we were to run this, actually let's copy this and then run this, you'll see that now it will work if we put the weather forecast endpoint in there. And now we got the data in here. And to find out for sure if this is being executed, we'll just put a breakpoint and just refresh this page and notice that this is actually getting executed. Just as before that we went over how this thing is being executed is that once you set this mapping, everything inside of this code gets executed, but not the whole program.cs. So if I was to put a breakpoint on this and take the breakpoint over here, and let's go ahead and execute this, and now if I refresh, that breakpoint won't get hit. Right? It doesn't get hit because the execution only happens between here. So this is called minimal APIs because it is not using controllers, and you can do the same thing for yourself. If you had more than one, you probably want to create a class that has all the mapping for you, and then in here just call the class that's going to do all of the mapping for you. In that way, it keeps it organized. Or if you feel comfortable, you can just put it in here. The only thing is that it's going to make this, if you have multiple mapping here, then it's going to make it a little complicated, not complicated, but kind of busy having all of this inside of the program.cs. All right, so this is done. We'll go ahead and comment this out now. And we'll undo everything here so we can actually now go creating APIs and using Entity Framework for our blog engine that we had worked on. And then, so then we're going to go ahead and extract all of the information that we set up in here over to our API. And then once the APIs are set up with the controllers, then what we're going to do is we're going to consume those APIs through our web page. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the blog website, and if you notice that if we go to the tools and we go to the NuGet package manager, in the installed options, you'll notice that we have the entity framework, which is installed on the blog site, as well as the SQL Server, as well as the tools. And what we want to do is we want to move these over to the our blog API, because that's where we're going to have all of the CRUD operations happen, as well as getting blogs and stuff. So, and what we want is the blog website to inherit or have a client that's going to call the API. To do that, so let's go ahead and uninstall from the blog website and have it installed in the super duper blog API. So I'm going to go ahead and install the tools, and then the SQL Server, as well as the design. So next what we're going to do is we're going to uninstall from blog website. There we go. So now we don't have any of that information here. Next, what we want to do is the builder service needs to have the context. And now, in order to do that, we need to move the data, which has our models as well as the context, over to our blog API. So let's go ahead and copy that over. So now that we have this, we no longer need the data. So let's go ahead and delete this. And then in the app.json, we have our connection string. So let's go ahead and copy that. Actually, we're going to cut that and then go to the app.json for the blog API and paste that in here. And then the next thing we want to do is we're going to go ahead and copy the server, the services being added. I guess over here should be fine. There we go. And let's go ahead and remove these references. We don't need these either. Okay. So now let's go ahead and build everything. Make sure there's no errors. So the build succeeded. There was no errors. So that's great. Next, what we need to do is we need to clean out these controllers. And instead, what we need to do is add our own controllers. So let's go ahead and delete these. We'll keep the debug one, but we'll delete the rest of them. There we go. And now let's go to the controller and add new controller. And we'll go to the API. And in this one, we're going to have the actions with the entity framework. Click Add. So here, this should be pretty familiar to you guys. We've done this in the Razor pages, the web ASP.NET Web Core that we did. So here, you can choose your model, whether it be categories or models. So we're going to go through this one at a time and go ahead and add one of these to our project. Now what I am going to do is, instead of calling this web application 1, I'm going to go ahead and fix that. So let's actually go to our data. I'll go block context. Instead of making this web application, let's go ahead and put this to super duper blog API data. And let's make sure that these guys are also set correctly. Okay, let's go ahead and save everything. And let's go ahead and close everything. And let's go ahead and remove this reference because we don't need that. What we do need is now the namespace for this. All right, so now that's set. Let's save that. Let's go close the NuGet package manager, and we'll close everything here. And then we'll go to the controller, and we'll add new controller. We'll go to the API, and this time we'll go back using entity framework. And now, well, let's start with the post. We'll do that first. and choose that, the SQL Server, and we'll keep this as post controller. Click Add. And there we go. So let's go ahead and run this. Now we may get an error because I don't have my SQL Server running. Let's go ahead and open our Docker container so we can run our SQL Server. All right, so let's go to our containers. Here's our container. Let's go ahead and start that. There we go. So that got started. And let's go back up here. If we try to do a get, there shouldn't be anything in there. So we got an error that the connection was successfully established with the server, that there's an error during the login process. Let's go ahead and actually go here and see if our security information is set correctly. Let's open our SQL Server. Let's also go back to our, and let's check the details. Let's connect. This can connect fine. And view details. And so the password is password1. This should work. Get posts. Let's try this again. So we're going to actually go to the connection string and have a value here where we're going to say trusted certificate is equals to true. This is a little bit less secure, but for the process of this, we can make sure this is set up. Just generally happens if you do Googling, you'll notice that whenever you have the Docker container, you get that because the SSL version that we are running is not supported, and so it's having to complain about that. Let's actually stop everything and then start over again and see if that's going to fix the issue for us. Okay, here we go. So now let's go ahead and try again. Let's remove this and see if we get an error. Okay, so this time we didn't get an error, but we also didn't get anything as far as in the response body. And the reason for that is because you see this array is empty. And the reason for that is because if you come in here to our database and we go to the blogs, to the tables, and we look at the post database, and if you select, there's no records in here. And that's why there's no issues with this. There's no records coming back. So now let's go ahead and look at, for example, the post. So if we try out, you can see here now that you can actually go here, modify these values, and able to post the data that we're looking for into the database, or you can manually go to this database and do an edit, and then put your data in here, and then you can see that data back here. So we know that this actually works, and now what we need to do is do this for all of the other controllers as well. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly do that, and then we'll come back and take a look at that. So I quickly went through and created some more controllers, and as you can see, we have now categories, we have post comments, and we have post. So the post will be the actual blog post. Post comments is when people will comment on the blog, and the categories are the categories that we're going to have for each post that we blog about. So if we take a look at the code, it's pretty much the same thing, and it's basically it's the same exact piece of code, CRUD operation that you see between the categories, the post, and the post comment section. So now that we've done this, next what we need to do is create a very simple interface that's going to show some blogs on our blog website, consuming the APIs that we've generated here. Now, of course, we don't have any data in our database, and we'll add that in there. We'll do that in the next session. So there is one other thing I wanted to talk about before going to create the HTTP client to access our API. And that is, if you notice that in our post comment, or pretty much any other controller that you select here, it'll have a specific pattern associated to it. So notice this one has get, put, post, and this one has delete, and this is just a private method that's a helper to do something. And so this HTTP GET is actually an HTTP verb that's used in browsers. But you can also use it in, for example, Postman, or creating your own JavaScript to call a web API. You can choose the verb that you want to use. Now, to quickly look at that, I have this Swagger UI opened up, and if you refresh this, then how does the browser actually go to the server and get this data? So if we go to inspect, and we'll go to network, and then refresh again, you'll notice that it's calling the index.html, and here's the index.html, and this has actually several, this is part of the HTTP envelope that's being sent over, and that generally has a header, body, and some other data. So if we look at the general one, and that's usually is part of the response headers, so you have a requested URL, and this is the URL we're heading, right? Next, you notice that it has the request method of get. And this is really the HTTP verb that I was talking about. And so if you look at these, this is a get, this is a post, this is a get, and it's a put, and a delete. And each one of these, if you were to execute this, it would actually send the request method of that value that you see here. So it would be HTTP delete, put, get, post, or another get. And that really maps to what we have in here. So here we're decorating this with an attribute saying that this is an HTTP GET, but it also has it's like a template we're passing of an ID, and that ID is really mapped to the parameter that we're passing to this post comment. This one doesn't have a HTTP value or anything, so just the GET request comes automatically and gets mapped to this. So the reason these two are different is because this actually is going to have a value. So it would be like you would call the post controller with no values, and then this will have a / and a number, and that's how it gets routed here. And then the HTTP put would be the same thing. So if you have an HTTP put in a value parameter being passed, you would have that in there, as well as the post comment. Now the put would have probably the post comment in the body, and then the post is will have this post comment in the body, and then HTTP delete. And this actually follows a architectural pattern, and you'll hear this comment pretty frequently, and it's called REST. REST actually stands for representational state transfer. And it's basically an architectural style that can build web APIs or web services. You'll hear people kind of interchange those two. And basically, the REST requests are made over HTTP, as we saw, and they use the same HTTP verbs as the browser do, and as we saw here. So they are conforming to the making this controller RESTful. And so, but then where's these values? Now, if you were to, for example, let's go to View, and let's go to our object browser. And if this is actually, if we go to the library of Microsoft ASP.NET Core, MVC Core, there's a namespace for Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC. And if we go down, we'll see all of the HTTP verbs that ASP.NET has implemented. And that's the delete, the get, the head, option, patch, post, put. And if you wanted more, then what you can do is you can go and actually create your own class and use the HTTP method attribute and inherit from this, and then you can implement that HTTP verb. Now, when you're testing this, when you're testing the web API, and if you don't have Swagger or anything enabled, maybe you're using someone else's API, there's a couple of ways to do this. One, you could use Fiddler. And Fiddler, what you can do is you can go to the Composer one and then compose all of your options in here. And if you see, you have the get, the post, the put, the head, the delete, and options, right? So you have some of those already here, but you have other ones that are not in here. Now, other people may not choose this. They might use Postman, and you've seen probably this as well. If you look at this one, it has the same thing: the get, the post, the put, the patch, delete, head, and option, and you have some other ones in here. So if you wanted to implement any one of these or have your own, basically, then you would have to go inherit from that attribute and then come into your method and then decorate that in there. Technically, in my opinion, there's really two HTTP verbs. Everything else is a extension of that, and that's really a get. So a get, the way a get works is that you always pass a URL. It has no other information. But then if you're using a post will actually have a URL and a body. The put is going to be pretty much the same thing as the post, except the verb name is different, and that's the distinction for that. Hopefully this explanation help you out a little bit about understanding the REST and how it uses the HTTP verbs to map. So the web APIs that are here to REST, just to clarify, they are a URL based, right? So, or I think people call them like URI, and the HTTP methods such as get, post, and other options, they're mapped to the action that you want to implement. And then the media type, so you saw that we were passing either JSON or XML. So hopefully this was a little bit more of a review of that. All right, so now let's go ahead to our website and create the clients to be able to access our web API. So here we're going to learn how to access our web API, to manually code it and also dynamically generate the code for us so we don't have to do it manually. Now, when you're starting your Swagger documentation, notice that you have this URL for the Swagger JSON. So this basically is a description of what you have in your website here. So if we go into this URL, you'll notice that this is a JSON object that describes our web APIs. And the way this works is that if you look, so we have, like, for example, categories. So if we go in here, this is our categories. And if you expand this, we're not expecting any parameters, but we do expect a 200 success. And then when we do, we get an object like this. So all of that is described here. So here's looking that we have this using HTTP GET, and then we have a response coming back of 200, and it's successful. It can accept three types: text JSON, application JSON, or text plain, depending on your client, what they're asking. Now, depending on what the client asks, most likely it'll be text JSON or application JSON. Then what you get back is a category object. And this schema is defined under components. So if we scroll down, there should be, so there you go, there's components, schemas, and then our category. So then this category is a type of object, and it has a bunch of properties, and these properties are basically the values in our object for category when we generated our entity framework. So that's basically what you have and how it's associated. Now, this was for a get. Now, what happens when you got a post? So here now we have a post, and when you're calling the categories, and then in the request body, you have a content and application JSON. Those are three different ways to access through the header. And then as you can notice that the schema for the body is exactly the same thing. So if you were passing a different object in the body, then here you would have a schema of a different type. Now, we can take this JSON object and then we can have a automatically have this created for us. So there's a couple of ways of doing this. You can come into the Swagger CodeGen and download this and have it, and then pass it the JSON object, and it'll create the code for you. And then there's also the refit that can do that for you as well. But there's this tool for .NET Open API tool command that you can do it. But you can also do this through Visual Studio. So if you come in here to Visual Studio and then right-click on your website and then say Add, and then go into service reference. In the service reference, you want to choose Open API and then choose Next. Here you can pass it either a URL or a file. Now what I did was that I went in here and I said Save As, and then I saved the Swagger JSON to my hard drive. So in here then you can browse and find the, just one level up, so there you go. You can point it to the Swagger JSON you have, then you give it a namespace. I called mine blog website because that's where it's going to reside, and then the name for it. So the name you generate, I already have one here, so I'm not going to finish this, but you could give it a name. Actually, I believe I call mine blog service Swagger. And then when you choose finish, what will happen is that you'll see something like this generated for you. So as you can see, I've already done this. It's already configured for me. If I go in here, you can click Edit, which will bring you back to this, and I called mine blog service Swagger. And so then where is that in here? Well, first thing it's going to do is it's going to create this Open APIs folder, and it's going to add our Swagger JSON. So it's basically copy from wherever we had it over to somewhere locally where it can access it. And it's basically exactly the same thing. Next, if you go over here and click Edit, or excuse me, View Generated Code, now you can see that it actually created the code dynamically for us, and it has all the methods that we need within this. There's a few things that's a little bit different. So you can notice that you have category 3 here, for example. There's multiple of them. And then if you look over here, you have category 2, and then also just the normal categories. And that's because if you looked at the Swagger doc, you'll notice that if we go back up here, so there's categories, there's multiple categories, like categories, even though these are different HTTP verbs that are being used. And that's what it's trying to do, is the first one that comes in, there's no numeric value, then the second one will have 2, 3, and so forth. And that's how it did that. So it might be a little confusing at first, but that's how it's done. So now, then where is this code? And if you bring your cursor on top of this, notice that it's actually gone to the OBG folder of your Swagger client.cs. And you can actually, if you bring your cursor over here to your blog website and click to show all files, then you're gonna see your bin folder in your OBG folder. And if you open this, notice that you have your Swagger client over here. If you expand this, notice that it also has some of the objects that you're going to be returning back in here as well. So that's basically how this is created. Now then, what happens and how do you access this when you are within the application? Because you don't see that. Now I do have, for example, a Swagger client that I created here. So it's basically, if you look, I copied it over, brought it here, so I can take a look at it and to see what how it generated for studying it. But I can delete this because I brought this manually, so it's actually not letting me delete it because I'm running Visual Studio, but later I'll delete it. So I brought this from the OBJ folder over, so this is not something that's going to be generated for you. Next, then, so how do you access this? So if we go into your pages, in the Razor pages, and we go inside the index, what you can do is you can access it this way, right? So basically, you create the blog web service Swagger, and this is what it's going to point to in the OBJ folder. And now that we have it, then we can say, give me categories async, passing it a value, or it doesn't have to be categories. Maybe it can be the post, right? And then it accepts a value and some cancellation tokens and stuff if you're doing asynchronous programming, which we are, right? So you would have to have an await in front of this in order for it to really work. Or you could then do the result if you're not doing asynchronously. And then, of course, here on the URL of the constructor, you would have to pass it the URL and then have the HTTP client. Now, you could make this so that you don't have to manually create it this way. This could be a configuration value that you can have in your app settings. So then you can read that from the app settings and then have the HTTP client automatically created for you and injected into our class. Now, how do you do that? Well, let's go ahead and comment this for now. So I also created a file manually rather than doing this dynamically generated for me. And I called mine blog web service. So if you go and notice that I have it here. And inside of this, I have a logger, I have HTTP factory, and then I just implemented one method. And inside of this, I'm just saying get blogs async, and I'm doing it asynchronously, returning back a array of blog, and it's a task object. And inside of this, I have my HTTP client. The HTTP client is being passed through the constructor as well as a logger. In case there's any exceptions, I can go ahead and log that as well. And then I am calling the URL for my API. So one of the things you want to do is when you run your project, let's go ahead and stop this. When you run it, go back to your configuration startup. In here, make sure you select multiple startup. And then because our website is dependent on the blog API, you want to make sure to use these up and down arrows to have your, if this is dependent on this, this should start up first. So that's, you want to make sure that this is moved up. And then that way you can use it in here. So go ahead and configure that. And then the next thing what you want to do is then how does this stuff get configured automatically for you? Well, if you remember in the previous, actually let's go ahead and delete this because I don't need this anymore. So if you come into your programs.cs where we're actually adding services and stuff, in here you'll notice I've added two records in here. The first one is HTTP client and the second one is a transient block service. So basically what we're saying here is that anytime a constructor requires an HTTP client, go ahead and generate that for us and pass it into the constructor. And here we're doing the same thing. We're saying that anytime a constructor is dependent on iBlog service, go ahead and generate a block service and pass it over. So for this piece is for the block service. And so anytime we construct this class, these will automatically be passed to you. Well, if you look in the programs.cs, we don't have anything for the logger, right? But yet the logger is in here. So then how is this working? if you go into the HTTP client and you go to this implementation, you'll notice that this has already been added for you. Now you could come into the blog to the build a services .add logging yourself. It's not going to hurt anything, but because this is being done, I didn't add it in there, and that's how that is being already mapped for you. So now that it is mapped, then why did I added this transient blog service for this, right? And that's because if I go to my index.cshtml, I created a constructor where I am passing a blog service. I'm asking for iBlog service and setting that into a public property. So then inside of the on get async, I call the blog service to get the blogs, and then I just return the page. And then that way you could make this in a public variable, so then you can go inside of your index page and do something with that object. So let's go ahead and run this again. So now that everything is executed, we can see that if we hit our breakpoint and we actually call our blog async, and if I go to my blogs, I do have 5 records in here. Now, if you can see, we have our active true content, and I have ID, and I have summary and title. And if we go to our database, and if we go to our post, I believe it was post, so if you do select top, you can see that I actually already went there and I added some records in here. I also have some for the categories, which this is actually the category tagging. So if you go in here now, you have your categories. So this basically is saying that a blog post of ID 4 is mapping to a category ID of 9. So if you go in here, so that's for that blog post is basically a category of health and wellness. And if we come over here, you'll notice that I only asked for the blog post, so now I have the blogs in here. Then I can decide what to do with these. So if you wanted to have another one where it says get blog async or blog async with passing an ID, then you basically would come over here, create a new method. You'd come over here and then you would create a new method and follow the same pattern to have a try catch and then have the error logging. But also make sure that if you added this, because it's part of this interface, that the method you have, the signature is also in here so that it can be accessed, because we're creating the object and passing it as an interface. So hopefully this gives you some idea of having a web API and then how to access that through your website. And again, if you wanted to do that through like the index HTML that we have, that we're creating this, if you wanted to have this blog service Swagger to do the same thing, what you could do is go in here and there are programs, and because we were actually executed, let's go ahead and stop that. So then we can say add transient, and this time we'll just pass it the blog Swagger. And the reason is because this guy, that is auto-generated, doesn't have an interface, and so we have to pass it this way. So now that we have this, we can go back to our interface and have this, and let's actually, there we go. So now we have a property for that, and if you wanted to do something with this, you could set it up. Now here we are passing some additional information. So this HTTP client would automatically work, but the URL would not. So you would have to go back and in the options, you need to have that so that it is passing back some, that it generates the URL and everything for you. So this concludes our video tutorial. Thank you so much. Hopefully it gives you a good overview of web APIs. We'll see you on the next tutorial. Bye.